As engineers, we refer to blockchains as state machines, which is an abstract model of what a computer is. You can kind of date like research papers to a 2017-ish era. If they say Visa scale, teams building on Polkadot on any layer of the stack should know that they're never going to run out of bandwidth. That's one area where I might have a bit of a different view than a lot of people at Parity.
The launch team wishes you good luck and Godspeed.
Space Monkeys blasting off with Sophia Gold. She's an engineering lead at Parity. Very, very lucky to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us what exactly an engineering lead of Parity does?
On the day-to-day?
Yeah.
Well, we have a number of different engineering teams, even what you'd consider core teams. We have a number of different teams. So I lead one of them. It's a particularly large team, so I actually co-lead it with two other people.
Okay.
Essentially, we're the team that's responsible for the Polkadot node. Increasingly, we refer to Polkadot as kind of a tech stack.
Yeah.
But, if when you are what the Polkadot validators run, when you're running a piece of software binary called Polkadot, that's what we build.
Sounds pretty core.
Yeah, it's as I mean, look, when I'm trying to get like invited to a conference, like a party at a conference or something, I say I lead the Polkadot core team, like hoping that being a relatively large market cap project that might mean something to people.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, doesn't always work, but
okay, we'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah. So you're working with Rob.
Yes.
Right.
That's Rob's team. Yeah.
Rob's team. Who else is on the team?
So I co-lead it with Robert Klotzner and Andre Sandu.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of have two sides of the team. One, I think they used to be two different teams.
Yeah.
Parachain's engineering that focuses on mainly performance issues, right? Primarily now they're working on scaling the number of validators that they can support in Parachain's consensus, which then equates to the number of parachains or number of cores, and then Parachain's protocol that is mainly on protocol features, and so that's roughly the two of them. And then I was brought on about 6 months ago mainly to kind of divide up what Rob has been doing alone for like a long time and look out for product things and communication things.
I feel like
do things like talk to you right here.
Yeah, right. I feel like there's been so much progress in the last 6 or 8 months coming out of Rob and his team. I guess this is in part thanks to the extra help that they brought on.
I'd like to say so, but I mean, the reality is like these kind of features take much longer to build. So really the things that we're just getting ready to launch now, long pre-exist me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what were you doing before you...
So I have been working as a core developer in crypto for a little over 5 years now. I don't know if this is like when you're on like a talk show and if you're like promoting a show on another network, you're just supposed to say on another network. So I was a core developer working on Tezos, which is another layer one. Mainly known for on-chain governance, right? And I think that they were the first non-federated proof-of-stake network to go live. This was back in 2018.
Right.
So I was there for that, got to see that, and with the rollout of institutional staking on exchanges in 2019, they were at the forefront of, learned a lot doing that. I was looking to kind of take my next step. Actually, it took quite a while to kind of decide on something, but this was a really unique role and on what a project that I find to be really interesting and I've followed basically since the white paper. Spent some time this summer. We've never measured the throughput of a parachain before, right?
Okay.
Naive, often kind of metric people that engineers kind of refer to derisively, right? But is heavily marketed, transactions per second.
That's right. I thought I saw that in your presentation.
Yeah, though you notice I didn't quite drop a number, but I said theoretical relative with this feature going live. But I've been trying to actually measure it, right? And I've got to a point where like I know how to do it, and it's just about the what I'm measuring being stabilized. I'm benchmarking Polkadot, right? But we have this whole tech stack, and there are all of these, there have been all these times where I've questioned, okay, why aren't the blocks filling up? Why aren't I reaching? And it's really all about the execution time. It's about the execution time of the Polkadot validators, right? And that because that's how we have to constrain resources of the network. And you want them to essentially be as close to the parameter, the timeout, as possible. So how do I explain this to some the non-technical people I work with? Like you get into a lift there's like a number of kilograms on the wall, right? And it says that this is the amount that it can support. And that's because they've done some kind of like load testing at the factory where, if you like get a little bit, some bigger people or more people, right? That's kind of like transactions, right? You can game it a little bit by maybe having very skinny people or something. You get more and you claim you can fit more, but we're really looking for the maximum it can handle. But in what I was going to say in doing so, I've like, ended up essentially finding numerous spots in the rest of our stack outside of Polkadot, right? Which I don't really consider myself measuring here. In Cumulus, the collator software, in Frame that parachains use, and all the way down Substrate essentially, and like asking someone like Basti, who's maybe knows our tech stack the best up to down, what line do I delete to make this go faster, right? To get more in there.
Yeah. Your overarching aim here.
Yeah.
Are you trying to see how far we can push scaling Polkadot?
I don't want to quite say that, right?
Okay.
Around the time I entered the industry, right, when people were really starting to focus on scaling as the biggest area of research across the whole crypto industry, everyone would use the term Visa scale.
Yeah, right.
You can kind of date like research papers to like a 2017-ish era if they say Visa scale, or they make a comparison to Visa.
Okay.
Back then, everyone thought that Visa could do, I think it was 47,000 transactions per second. But that turned out to be, that was based on peak load on a test network. And my understanding is actually Visa averages out to something like about 2,000.
Okay.
Which doesn't sound like a lot if you consider the number of people with Visa cards worldwide making point-of-sale transactions, in different time zones at any given time. My point with blockchains especially, and programmatic money, is that they, one, the usage is probably lower than people are saying, but they also adapt to positively or negatively to their throughput constraints, right?
Okay.
So you see this in a way with Bitcoin, right? Where I think 7 TPS is maybe fine for Bitcoin, and you see this in the opposite direction with, say, Solana, right? Which Solana, my understanding, does sometimes have, they at least claim to have like actual usage in like the thousands, but then I think those are largely because of trading bots doing kind of unsophisticated forms of algorithmic trading on central limit order book dexes that are often not supported on lighter weight chains, sort of. So I'm not here to make an argument of like whether that's positive or negative, but you see them have higher throughput because you can do that, because it's cheaper to do that. Therefore, people write these bots that do, right?
Okay, right.
So bring it back around, I suppose, when you're asking, is my goal to scale Polkadot as much as possible? Well, one, I'd say my goal is to make sure that we have a plan to, right? Because I think that people building on Polkadot, teams building on Polkadot, on any layer of the stack, should know that they're never going to run out of bandwidth, right? And they're not going to be constrained by building a parachain on Polkadot. I really want people to see parachains as sovereign chains, and we could talk more about what that means. So the idea that we have a plan, with also keeping in mind that I think that people might have a greater idea of what they need than in practice. And then also that scaling is a really overloaded term, right? So when I say scaling, I don't always just mean scaling throughput.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't mean scaling throughput as meaning only scaling transactions, right? I would say the two biggest sources of throughput needs are DeFi trading, which I just mentioned as an example on Solana, for example, and as a real peak phenomenon, which again matters, NFT drops. Right.
Okay.
So, like, for example, I think that we have a gaming company building on a parachain, and it might be like 1,000 TPS or something just for that drop.
Yeah.
But they also, for whatever reason, need to run an EVM parachain, which is great. You can do that, right? And people want to do that for compatibility's sake. I think, though, if you were to optimize a parachain and Substrate for NFT drops, then you could do a lot better, right? So that's one case, the flexibility, I mean. And then we could also talk about scaling the number of processes that the network supports, right?
Okay.
So, like, number of parachains we support. So it's important not just to talk about the total network throughput. That matters. The throughput per parachain matters, but also the number of parachains.
So this is the number of parallel operations we can do. Is that what you're speaking about?
I wouldn't quite put it that way.
How would you put it?
If you're using like a metaphor that Polkadot is a distributed computer, which we tend to do in the way that we name certain things, right?
Right.
Technically speaking, it's we refer to, as engineers, we refer to blockchains as state machines, which is an abstract model of what a computer is. And a state machine is defined by a state transition function, and it's the number of those functions that you can support. Right. Now, with also the idea, and Gav is recently talking about this, that those might apply to things that are not blockchains specifically, right?
Yeah.
That's one area where I might have a bit of a different view than a lot of people at Parity, right?
Yeah.
Than Sean, for example, right? In that, I think largely the networks we're building are meant to run blockchains, not say smart contracts, for example, with other types of storage backends.
Sure.
And blockchains are really designed to solve the double spend problem.
Right.
Which means to me that they are really meant for largely financial use cases. Not entirely. There are some exceptions. Identity is a really notable one that they're good for, right?
Yeah.
But largely financial use cases. And I think that, someone like Sean, I heard him saying this summer at PBA we both went to, that, crypto is only used for DeFi, or blockchains are only used for DeFi, and we need to have use cases beyond that. I think DeFi is pretty great, to be honest. And more importantly, I think that I weight the importance of finance in the world more than some people might. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So people ask, we're waiting for the killer use case for crypto. I think it's always been there. It is censorship-resistant money. I believe in economic freedom.
Yeah, you spoke specifically about DeFi, but I guess it applies to all markets, right? We mentioned Mythical before, and there are markets in games, right?
Yeah, I still consider that finance, right?
And what about Energy Web, for instance, right? There's like a whole energy market there as well. So you would wrap that all into DeFi.
Well, I mean, when we say DeFi, typically we mean automated market making contracts, for example, things that are, programmatic, decentralized because they're autonomous and programmatic, right? So I don't just mean DeFi in that sense.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm including things like NFTs representing like game artifacts as finance, especially in terms of finding Polkadot's place, right, in comparison to other protocols, other networks, other systems. There's basically a class of systems now that kind of dominate work on heterogeneous scaling, right? Include ZK rollups, optimistic rollups, parachains, which are very roll-up-like at the very least.
Yeah.
And these are two-phase systems, right? They have one step where they order state transitions and they publish the data, and then they only later check the correctness, right? And what I was saying, usually when I make the comparison of Polkadot to these other systems, I am comparing the second stage, approval checking, right? Because the fact that we bake this first phase into the staking economics and the L1 validator set gives us two things, right? Capital efficiency. There's about roughly currently $10 million worth of DOT attached to every parachain block that is included in the relay chain.
Okay.
Which means that 100% of that would be slashed if any of those were later found out to be invalid, right? Invalid state transition. Then from the side of a parachain, right, who is paying for an auction slot, I think there's a lot of FUD about the price of the auction slots, right?
Yeah.
They roughly, I think, auction slots are going for about $1 million now, which means they're looking at about $100,000 a year in opportunity cost, right? This is all to say that the validators that are locking this $10 million have many sources of revenue from the work that they're doing with that stake. It is cheaper for the parachains to outsource this work, right? And at the same time, also, there are more sources of revenue for the Polkadot validators, right? So that's what I mean by capital efficiency. I think that's less of a popular thing to talk about, especially because, well, if you look at the alternative of spinning up your own validator set and deflating your token, that tends to be pretty popular because people like what we call the money illusion, right? Hard money people in crypto are kind of having stopped clock moment right now, right, in the macroeconomic setting. But what kind of upsets me is that I think that the way that they talk about inflation is as if the inflation is defined by increase in the money supply.
Yeah.
We actually define inflation by a decrease in purchasing power, right?
Okay.
We can't measure the purchasing power of crypto because the reality is these are, probably digital native assets are closest to commodities, and they don't really function quite like a currency in terms of their stability, and we're not like pricing baskets of goods in them, right?
Right. Okay.
But, if we could, you would see that, well, Polkadot validators really they're not like earning 10%, they're only earning what they're not being diluted in, right?
Yeah, right.
But people like that sense that it's yield. That's very psychologically popular.
Of course,
right?
yeah.
The second part of it, right, that I think is I more want to talk about, the censorship resistance.
Yes.
So, and this applies also, I'm going to say it both on the backing and the approval checking side. And what I was saying on the side of backing is that, the backers are assigned randomly, right? So I'm not a lawyer, right? But I think from any kind of like legal regulatory argument, they have they're not endorsing the contents of parachain blocks, right? And they're kind of disinterested in them. They're really just providing a utility. There's that they're in backing groups, so that one couldn't affect liveness for even one block. And then they're rotated every block, right? So they're randomly assigned, randomly rotated every block, and all this ensures that they're not censoring from a liveness perspective, parachains that are assigned to them, right? Polkadot, we're sorting essentially, currently it's 30, Web3 research says maybe it should be 40, committees of that size out of the Polkadot validator set, assigned to check each parachain block, right? Now, if you're trying to select 30 random parties, right, without replacing them out of 300 or 500 or 1,000, right, as we try to scale the validator set, it turns out that you're not going to get a statistically representative set of them, right?
Okay.
So you can't make that 67% assumption inside this group of 30. And it turns out that it's actually, it's not mathematically improbable that they're all the malicious guys, the faulty guys that you picked out.
Understood.
Instead, what we do is we, so first of all, it would be because backers are slashed 100%. We use a property called Gambler's Rune that they wouldn't be able to. They only have essentially one shot per every $10 million that they have to guess when they're all going to be malicious, right? Out of that, and then if just one of them is honest. So we're bringing this is that instead of relying on any kind of honest majority assumption like we would in L1 in this. What we call tranche 0, the first 30 that are selected that are needed to approve this block, we're relying on one honest one, and then the one honest one can raise it to the entire validator set. We have something then, and that's called a dispute, which has to be just a threat, right? Because it's not something that we'd expect to happen in production.
So if any raises alarm,
then everyone checks it, and then you do have the honest majority assumption, right? So the question is, what do you get from doing it the way that we do it that takes all this work, right? And I think that we're not great at communicating that.
What is it?
I'm going to say that censorship resistance, in my mind, is a big thing. And at the backing layer, you get that this way. At the approval checking layer, let me give you an example. So Coinbase Base, right?
Yeah.
Base has a centralized sequencer, because it's built on OpStack, it has no fraud proof. So when I said sometimes there's a closed set who can submit it, it actually takes can submit a fraud proof, it actually takes some engineering work to make that an open set, which Arbitrum I think has going through governance now. And sometimes it's no one. OpStack, Optimism will get there and have fraud proofs, right? But it's not a priority of theirs versus UX, which is again cultural, a different choice.
Yeah.
When they do, I don't think they'll have an open proposer set or an open verifier set to submit them. And then how are they incentivized to submit them, right? This is called the verifier's dilemma. And is there a path to sequencer decentralization? Will that be, how is that going to work? The end game for Ethereum is all roll-up bridges, right? That's going to be the main application, and all scaling will be through roll-ups, through L2s. In practice, there is kind of a Schelling point of decentralization amongst modern proof-of-stake networks that a large number of people in the industry care about, and as a practical test of that, I think the greatest one has been the OFAC sanctions against Tornado Cash and how that's poisoned the ETH, right? That touches it, and yet operations to that contract continue to be included in Ethereum blocks, right?
Right.
Despite there being, I don't know what percentage of validators based in the United States, and it doesn't really matter based in the United States, based anywhere where the U.S. government has, its reach, right? It's almost everywhere. And they continue to be included, right? And that's the most extreme Treasury Department sanctions, kind of really the only area where we've seen the greatest force of financial censorship in the world, in human history, the United States government being willing to meddle in on-chain events, and yet it continues to run. Right?
So are you saying if that was deployed on an L2, you could just censor it? The only reason it's being included is because it's on the core.
I'm saying
on the
it's
L1.
unimaginable for me for it to be included on an L2.
Right. It wouldn't.
Right. Whereas, Tornado Cash Parachain, first you do need liquidity, right? So that's the Elizabeth Warren thing of, are the oligarchs, could they be Russian oligarchs laundering billions of dollars through like a mixnet? Well, no, it doesn't have, you have you'd be splitting this up. And she's like, well, why can't they just split it up and do one transaction every day for 30 days? Well, there's slippage and they'd be taking up all the liquidity on it. But, from a purely operational standpoint, parachains have open proposer sets, right? We shipped decentralized sequencers almost 2 years ago. They have anyone can propose a parachain, a block for a given parachain. The backers, right, I already said, are essentially disinterested as to the content of it, and randomly assigned and assigned redundantly and rotated.
Yeah.
And, the approval checkers, I think the comparison here with something like Base is that, it's easy to imagine when I said Coinbase on their centralized exchange is freezing accounts. It's easy to imagine them wanting to do the same thing through the sequencer, right? But if something were to already occur on Base, would they reorg the chain post hoc, right? To revert whatever the offending transaction was? I think it would take something rather serious for them to take that kind of PR hit to do that.
But I guess it's the fact that they can.
They can do that,
right?
With no question. Yeah. Anyone running on OpStack can do that, and doesn't work that way in a parachain.
The one thing you keep coming back to in this conversation has been censorship resistance. What happened in your life that made you so passionate about resisting, centralized force? I
don't know if I could say there's something in particular, right? But what we have seen, if you look at the age I'm at, right, it is corresponded with, commerce really moving onto the internet, right? So, and there's been great benefit of that. But that's what has effectively made this possible, right? It used to be, say, maybe I'm aging myself, but 15 years ago, right? If you were running a web-based business, you were uniquely at risk in the ability of credit card processors or people, and it's quite easy for, again, the U.S. government to call up credit card processors and essentially have you cut out of the global payments network, and then your online business is done, right? And that's essentially everyone now. Yeah. Right? Operation Choke Point, right? Lack of access to banking services, credit card processing, PayPal and other kind of neobanks, actual banks freezing accounts, right? Yeah. People who are unbanked, people I know in other nations, right? You had Web3 philosopher on here from Nigeria, right? Yeah. They have, some more problems obviously there, and
well, it's even where I'm from, Canada, we had this truckers convoy.
Yes, right. And so I guess, also I would hope that this is a concern that could cut across, the political binary, right? Right. It's not great to be on the side of the government and banks closing people's accounts and deciding who they can transact with just because they might be on a different, I don't really support the truckers, right? But it's a bad precedent. Right. And there's movement.
When you're on the wrong side.
Yeah, and if you look at actually, the censorship tends to occur at the behest of the U.S. government through sort of griefing these companies with regulatory burden.
Yeah,
right?
right.
I'm not so confident that legislation or legal precedent is going to fix this problem.
Yeah.
But I think that having an alternative, even if it doesn't have to be the thing that everyone is using,
Yep.
that matters, and that has mattered to real people for some time.
So do you think Polkadot is the tech stack to get us there?
Yes, I think that I said this to Robert, right? That he was like, well, then all you need is Bitcoin. But no, right? You need programmatic money. So Bitcoin's not fully programmatic, and you do need it to scale, right? And I think it's clear, and this is not an unpopular thing for me to say now, that the future of scaling, both in terms of transactions and in terms of unique processes, venues, application-specific chains, is this heterogeneous scaling, right? God, I had to wire the person money that I'm renting from, and it fucking sucks. Like,
right.
Still.
Yeah,
so
totally.
maybe like you don't have to be like a dissident or someone who's otherwise targeted to. To feel how there's friction in money. You just have to be someone who's tried to wire it across a border.
Yeah, life is still inconvenient for sure.
Yeah. So I think that's reflected in what we build.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Sophia, I think I understand why multiple people at Parity encouraged me to get you on this show, why students at the PBA were so excited about the lessons that you were teaching them. It's really awesome to have you on the show. Now, I don't want to take this on too much longer. I don't want to ruin the vibes of this party here, but what do you think about the vibes in Polkadot right now? And what would you do to change them?
Well, God, I guess you could always cut if I say something bad.
Yeah, that's what I say. Just speak from the heart, and we'll fix it in post. How would you describe the vibes?
At its worst, I think, we can seem both corporate and like we're socialists. Right?
Okay.
So that's kind of a bad combination.
Okay.
You don't really get any benefit there. But purely like in terms of the vibes, I don't think that's really reflected in the community or reflected in the technology at all. And that's why, like, when I say something about like censorship resistance, right? I think that's something everyone can get behind.
Right. Yeah.
That's a vibe, right? And that's something that we see pop up as a concern again and again in the industry, but is not necessarily like a thread running through most communities. I'd like to see things more on a guerrilla level, I suppose.
Cool.
There's always a problem, and this isn't new to me, right, in this community of great funding, right, and how that you try earnestly to do things with all that money, and that can also have sort of negative effects on the community and give you a negative image in terms of we spend a lot on marketing, right? And everyone is trying really hard. Maybe that if you look at the Ethereum Foundation doesn't have a marketing department, I think.
Yeah.
They have a comms guy, I know, but like, Bitcoin doesn't have anything like that, right? And they clearly have a vibe that, they're kind of, freedom-loving idiots. So, I don't know. I would like to see a little bit more of that kind of guerrilla-level vibe.
I think that's right. Scalable
Yeah.
censorship resistance. That's a banner we could get behind. You don't even need marketing for that. That's just something that feels true.
There's really not, like technically, what would your other example be of scalable censorship resistance?
Great talking to you, Sophia. That was awesome.
Likewise, and thanks so much for having me.